The first reading today is from the 12th chapter of Romans. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And a reading from 1 Peter. Finally, all of you have unity of spirit, sympathy, love for one another, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. It is for this that you were called, that you might inherit a blessing. For those who desire life and desire to see good days, let them keep their tongues from evil and their lips from speaking deceit. Let them turn away from evil and do good. Let them seek peace and pursue it. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. I'm going to be moving through a number of Bible passages today, so to make that easier for you, I prepared the handout that has the primary passages printed on it that I'm going to be referring to. Going forward, if I do that again, those will be sitting by the bulletin, so whatever's on the table, pick one of those up too, except don't take anything out of the offering plate. Also, I want to make a disclaimer before I begin. What I am about to say does not apply to child abuse or spouse abuse or bullying. If you are abused or bullied, please tell someone and get the help that you need. Neither Jesus nor the Bible ask you to bear that. Last Wednesday, I concluded that good courage to serve God with gladness comes from God, and that good courage comes from listening to the Son of God, Jesus, and that good courage comes from obeying everything Jesus commanded. This past Sunday, I concluded that righteousness comes through faith, and that faith is believing God is who God says God is, and God can do what God says God can do, and that, therefore, faith is our doing what God asks us to do. Which brings us to our hard topics for today. Hold fast to that which is good, render to no one evil for evil. Both the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul, from whose letters our readings came, were anxious to instruct new Christians in what it meant to obey everything Jesus commanded. They lifted up the ways that Christians were expected to live, not only with each other, but also in contrast to the non-Christians that they lived among. Paul's description of Abraham's righteousness by faith we heard about on Sunday from the 4th chapter of Romans eventually turns to what that righteousness looks like in daily Christian living. Within that description, we find Paul's admonitions: do not repay anyone evil for evil, and do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Peter, likewise, instructed the early church in how to live as God's people transformed by the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. He likewise admonished the church: do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. Peter also quoted Psalm 34, a psalm of praise for deliverance from trouble, which encouraged the children of Israel to turn away from evil and do good. So holding fast to that which is good and not rendering to anyone evil for evil were not new ideas for faithful people of God. They had always been instructions for the people of God. Between the writing of Psalm 34 and the writing of Paul's and Peter's letters, Jesus had a lot to say about these things. And Jesus did a lot to demonstrate that he meant these things. First, Jesus preached those things his followers should do in his famous Sermon on the Mount, which is recorded in chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew's Gospel. The Sermon on the Mount is not just the Beatitudes, they are just the beginning of the sermon. The Sermon on the Mount isn't just the portion I've selected for today either. So if you want to know more completely what Jesus expects of his followers, you need to read the whole thing. In fact, reading the whole of Paul's letter to the Romans and the letter of Peter would be quite profitable as well. Well, in fact, any Bible reading that you do is quite profitable. Recently, in a sermon on Jesus' sermon, I commented on what scholars call the antitheses, statements that begin with, "you have heard," and then conclude with, "but I say to you." One of those antitheses happens in the Matthew reading regarding our topics. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven." In Luke's version of Jesus' sermon, which Luke said happened on a level place rather than on a mountain, Jesus said very familiar words, very similar words. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Jesus clearly meant those words, and they are not debatable. If he didn't mean them, or if he considered them debatable, Jesus never would have died. He especially would not have died asking God to forgive the people who were killing him. Those who considered Jesus to be their enemy, the political and religious authorities, killed him, and in return, Jesus forgave them. So yes, I am certain that Jesus meant for us to love and pray for and forgive our enemies. Other New Testament writings confirm it as well. In the Acts of the Apostles, Stephen, the first martyr of Christianity, as he was being stoned, cried out, just as Jesus did, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul, who was regularly beaten and imprisoned himself, said, "When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we speak kindly. In his first letter to the Thessalonians, he appealed to the Christians, saying, "See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all." We know from history and the daily news, if not from personal experience, that repaying evil for evil only perpetuates evil. Jesus defeated evil by employing the counterintuitive measures of goodness. And by doing so, Jesus changed the world. Not that evil is no longer present in the world, or that goodness is somehow now easier, or that the world doesn't need any more changing. There is still much for the followers of Jesus to do. Much for us to do. And so we are commissioned and exhorted and commanded to hold fast to that which is good and render to no one evil for evil. Amen.